Erin Caffey. Love is supposed to be redemptive. It is supposed to bring out the best in us, inspire growth, and teach us sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. But sometimes, in the wrong hands, love becomes a weapon. And when a teenage girl decides that her romantic fantasy matters more than the lives of those who raised and protected her, that weapon is aimed directly at the heart of the family. In the early morning hours of March 1st, 2008, flames consumed a modest home in Alba, Texas, a town with fewer than 500 residents. Neighbors woke to the glow of the fire and the sound of sirens piercing the quiet countryside. When firefighters arrived, they discovered a scene that would haunt even the most experienced responders. Inside the burning house were the bodies of Penny Caffey and her two young sons, 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler. All three had been shot. Penny had also been attacked with a samurai sword in an act of such savagery she was nearly decapitated. The only family member missing was 16-year-old Erin Caffey, who investigators initially feared might have been kidnapped or killed. But within hours, the truth emerged, and it was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The Caffeys were deeply religious people who centered their lives around their church. The entire family played instruments together, performing during services with devotion that was both touching and genuine. Erin, the oldest child, sang with such passion she would sometimes cry during worship. They homeschooled their children using a Bible-based curriculum and were known throughout their community as dedicated, loving parents. But beneath this veneer of faith and harmony, a dangerous obsession was taking root in Erin's mind. 5 months before the murders, Erin began dating 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson, whom she met while working at a Sonic restaurant. The relationship progressed quickly, with Charlie giving her his grandmother's engagement ring as a promise of commitment. But when Penny noticed the ring during a church function, she demanded Erin return it. The Caffeys had begun to investigate their daughter's boyfriend and discovered his MySpace page filled with references to drinking and sexual content. They made the decision any concerned parent would make. They forbade Erin from seeing him. On February 27, 2008, 3 days before the murders, Terry and Penny sat their daughter down and told her the relationship was over. To their surprise, Erin agreed without protest, even tearfully confessing she had wanted to end things but had not known how. She promised to break up with Charlie before Bible study that evening. It was a lie. What the Caffeys did not know was that their daughter had been planning something far darker. Erin had already tried to recruit a previous boyfriend to murder her family, but he had refused. Now, with Charlie Wilkinson, she found someone willing to act. For weeks, Erin and Charlie discussed how to remove the obstacles standing between them: her parents and brothers. According to Wilkinson's later testimony, he initially suggested they simply run away together. But Erin was insistent. She wanted her family gone. Before the attack began, Wilkinson warned her he would have to murder her younger brothers to avoid leaving witnesses. Her response was chilling. She reportedly told him she did not care, that he should just do what needed to be done. While Wilkinson and his friend, 22-year-old Charles Wade, entered the Caffey home, armed with a pistol and a samurai sword, Erin waited outside in a car with Wade's girlfriend, Bobby Johnson. The assault began around 3 in the morning. Terry Caffey was shot 5 times and forced to watch as his wife was gunned down and then hacked with the blade. Upstairs, the 2 boys were awakened by the commotion. Matthew's last words, as his father heard them, were a desperate plea. "Charlie, Charlie, why are you doing this?" Both children were executed, one shot in the face, the other killed with the sword. The attackers then set the house on fire, believing everyone inside was gone. Terry Caffey, despite his wounds, managed to crawl out and reach a neighbor's property. When investigators found Erin at the trailer where Charlie was staying, she claimed she had been taken against her will. the story fell apart almost immediately. Wilkinson and Wade identified her as the architect of the plan. On January 2nd, 2009, Erin accepted a plea agreement and received 2 consecutive life sentences. She will be eligible for parole when she is 59. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade were also sentenced to life without parole. As of today, Erin Caffey remains incarcerated at the Texas Department of Corrections in Gatesville. Her father, Terry, has publicly forgiven her and maintains contact, though she continues to deny orchestrating the massacre. She insists she was forced to participate. The evidence, however, tells a different story. The story of a girl who loved a boy more than the family who gave her everything, and who chose annihilation over separation. Jennifer Pan. Some lies are so small they barely ripple the surface of life. A missed homework assignment blamed on a forgotten backpack. A test score rounded up by a few points. But what happens when those lies multiply, year after year, stacking like cards in an increasingly unstable tower? What happens when the fear of that tower collapsing becomes so overwhelming that murder seems the only way to keep it standing? This is the story of a young woman who built her life on deception, and when the truth threatened to break through, she made a choice that would shatter her family forever. On the night of November 8, 2010, a panicked 911 call came from a home in Markham, Ontario. The caller was 24-year-old Jennifer Pan, reporting a home invasion. She told the dispatcher that 3 armed men had broken into her house, tied her to the staircase banister, ransacked the home, and shot her parents before fleeing with $2,000. Her father, 57-year-old Hue Han Pan, had been shot in the face and shoulder. Her mother, 53-year-old Bichha Pan, had been shot multiple times and was already gone. To officers arriving on scene, it appeared to be a senseless act of violence against an immigrant family who had worked tirelessly to build a comfortable life in Canada. But investigators soon discovered something far more sinister than a random home invasion. Jennifer was the daughter of Vietnamese refugees who fled their homeland in 1979 and settled in Markham. Her parents were devoted to giving their children opportunities they never had. They worked long hours, her father as a tool and die maker, her mother managing an automotive parts company. They held high expectations, enrolling Jennifer in piano, figure skating, and martial arts. She was expected to excel academically and follow a path toward a respectable career in medicine, pharmacy, or law. For years, Jennifer appeared to be the model daughter, a straight-A student destined for success. But the reality was starkly different. In high school, Jennifer's grades began to slip. Rather than tell her parents, she forged report cards. When she did not gain admission to university, she fabricated an acceptance letter to Ryerson University with a fake scholarship. For 2 years, she pretended to attend classes, leaving home with textbooks and returning with made-up stories. When her parents expected a diploma, she created a counterfeit document. She then claimed acceptance into the pharmacology program at the University of Toronto and spent another 2 years maintaining the fiction. She even fabricated pay stubs from a pharmacy job she never had. During these years, Jennifer secretly dated Daniel Wong, a young man who dealt marijuana and worked at Boston Pizza. Her parents discovered the relationship and, disturbed by Wong's background, forbade her from seeing him. Jennifer moved in with Wong temporarily, but returned under her parents' supervision. They gave her an ultimatum: cut all ties with Wong or leave home. But Jennifer had no intention of giving up her boyfriend or the inheritance she believed awaited her. Instead, she began plotting something unthinkable. Through a series of texts and calls on what prosecutors called her secret murder phone, Jennifer coordinated with Wong to hire 3 men to attack her parents. The plan was simple: leave the front door unlocked. The men would enter, make it look like a robbery, and shoot her parents. She would receive $10,000 from her inheritance to pay for the hit. On the stand, she claimed she had hired the men to take her own life, not her parents', but the evidence told a different story. After the attack, Jennifer called 911 and claimed she had been tied up. Her father survived and, when he emerged from his coma, told police he had seen Jennifer speaking softly and friendly with one of the attackers. Investigators noted other suspicious details. Valuable items had been left untouched. Jennifer somehow managed to dial 911 with her hands supposedly bound. During interviews, her story shifted repeatedly. On November 22, 2010, Jennifer Pan was arrested. In January 2015, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Her father, who had lost his wife and was permanently blinded, provided a written statement. When he lost his wife, he lost his daughter too. Today, Jennifer Pan remains incarcerated. The young woman who could not face disappointing her parents committed the greatest betrayal imaginable, proving that sometimes the weight of expectations, when met with deception rather than honesty, leads to consequences far more devastating than any failing grade. Sarah Marie Johnson. Adolescence is a battlefield of competing loyalties. The pull toward independence clashes with the bonds of family. The intoxication of first love battles against parental wisdom. Most teenagers navigate this territory with slammed doors and tearful arguments, eventually emerging into adulthood with relationships bruised but intact. But what happens when that internal war escalates beyond rebellion into something unforgivable? What happens when a 16-year-old girl, convinced her parents stand between her and happiness, decides the only solution is their permanent removal from her life? On the morning of September 2, 2003, Sarah Marie Johnson ran screaming to her neighbor's house in Bellevue, Idaho. She was hysterical, barely able to form words, telling them that someone had shot her parents. Inside the Johnson family home, investigators found a scene of domestic horror. 46-year-old Alan Scott Johnson had been shot twice in the chest as he stepped out of the shower, his body collapsing in the bathroom doorway. His wife, 52-year-old Diane Johnson, had been shot in the head while she slept in their bed. Both were gone. Sarah told police she had been asleep in her bedroom when she heard gunshots. She claimed she ran to her parents' room, found them bleeding and dying, and fled to call for help. It should have been the account of a traumatized daughter who had narrowly escaped death herself. But within hours, investigators began to see through the performance. The Johnsons had seemed like a family living the American dream. Alan co-owned a landscaping company, and Diane worked at a medical clinic. They had built a comfortable life in the scenic resort town of Sun Valley, providing their two children with stability and opportunity. Their older son, Matthew, was away at the University of Idaho, pursuing his education. Sarah was a student at Wood River High School in nearby Haley. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But inside the home, tensions had been building to a breaking point over one issue. 19-year-old Bruno Santos. Santos was everything the Johnsons feared for their daughter. He was a high school dropout with ties to drug dealing and gang activity. He was in the country without legal status. Sarah had become infatuated with him, convinced she was experiencing profound and lasting romance. Her parents saw something different, a predatory older man pursuing their underage daughter. The conflict between Sarah and her parents over Santos had become explosive. They forbade her from seeing him. She defied them repeatedly. Alan Johnson had even confronted Santos directly, warning him to stay away from Sarah and threatening to report him to authorities for statutory rape, which would likely result in his removal from the country. But Alan never followed through with that threat. The Saturday before the murders, Diane and Alan discovered that Sarah had spent the night at Santos's apartment. The confrontation that followed would be their last. The physical traces Sarah left behind told a story her words could not erase. In the garbage can outside the Johnson home, which police intercepted before it could be emptied, investigators found a bathrobe containing DNA from both victims and from Sarah herself. There was a leather glove with gunshot residue on it, and a latex glove. In Sarah's bedroom, they found the matching leather glove, unused ammunition matching the murder weapon. A Winchester rifle taken from the guest house on their property was discovered on her nightstand. A spent shell casing was in the garage. The robe had dried paint residue inside it that matched paint found on the shirt Sarah wore that morning. Gunshot residue was present on the robe. Most damning of all, the rifle had been taken from their tenant's closet at approximately 6:20 in the morning. Sarah had a key to the guest house and knew the tenant would be away. During questioning, Sarah's story shifted constantly. She gave multiple conflicting accounts of what she was doing, what she heard, and when she discovered her parents. When confronted with the mounting physical traces linking her to the crime, she suggested increasingly desperate alternatives, even proposing that knives found at the scene might be gang symbols indicating she was being targeted. But the physical record was unambiguous. Sarah had retrieved the rifle, walked into her mother's bedroom and shot her while she slept, then continued to the bathroom where she shot her father as he emerged from the shower. On March 16, 2005, after a lengthy trial, a jury found Sarah Johnson guilty of 2 counts of murder. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms, plus 15 years for a firearm enhancement. Her defense attempted to shift blame to Santos or to Christopher Hill, whose fingerprints were found on the rifle from when he had helped the tenant move in months earlier. But no evidence connected either man to the crime itself. Multiple appeals have been rejected, including attempts by the Idaho Innocence Project to have DNA retested using newer technology. Courts have repeatedly found that no new information would change the overwhelming case against her. Today, Sarah Marie Johnson remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho, serving life without parole. Her brother Matthew lost both his parents and his sister on the same day. The girl who chose temporary passion over permanent family now faces the rest of her life, confronting what that choice cost her and what it took from everyone who loved Alan and Diane Johnson. Carly Madison Gregg. Security cameras are installed in homes to capture intruders, to preserve evidence, to provide peace of mind when families are away. They record strangers, not family members. They document threats from outside, not from within. But on a spring afternoon in Brandon, Mississippi, a home security system captured something no parent imagines. Their own child, pacing through the kitchen with a gun concealed behind her back, preparing to cross a line that can never be uncrossed. March 19th, 2024 began as an ordinary Tuesday at the Smiley household. 40-year-old Ashley Smiley, a mathematics teacher at Northwest Rankin High School, had spent her day educating students in the same building her 14-year-old daughter Carly attended. That afternoon, Ashley received information that would change everything. A friend of Carly's told Ashley that Carly had been hiding a substantial amount of cannabis in her bedroom, along with electronic cigarettes and burner phones. The revelation shattered Ashley's perception of her daughter's behavior and set in motion a confrontation that would end in violence. The family had been navigating challenges with Carly for some time. She had been transferred from another school after bringing a knife onto campus. She struggled with mental health issues that included mood swings, difficulty sleeping, and reports of hearing voices. Her family tried interventions, including medication and equine-assisted therapy, hoping to stabilize her emotional state. Heath Smiley, her stepfather who worked as a physical therapist, would later testify that Carly's struggles may have been influenced by her biological father's history with substance use. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened that afternoon. The home surveillance footage tells a story more disturbing than testimony could convey. The video shows Carly walking through the kitchen, appearing almost casual as she holds a .357 Magnum revolver behind her back. The weapon belonged to her mother, a gift from Heath, intended for protection. Moments later, gunshots ring through the house. Carly had entered her mother's bedroom and shot Ashley twice in the face, ending her life instantly. Then, in behavior that speaks to a chilling composure, the footage shows Carly returning to the kitchen, where she texted on her phone and played with the family dogs as her mother lay deceased in the next room. What came next reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her actions. Carly invited a friend to come over to the house. When the friend arrived, Carly allegedly asked a question pulled from a horror film. "Have you ever seen a deceased body?" She then showed her friend her mother's body. The friend left immediately. But Carly was not finished. When Heath arrived home from work, she ambushed him, shooting him in the shoulder. Heath, despite his wound, managed to wrestle the gun away as Carly fled. He survived and later called 911. At her trial in September 2024, Carly's defense built a case around an insanity plea. Child psychologist Dr. Andrew Clark testified that Carly had been experiencing depression, auditory hallucinations, and dissociation, potentially worsened by her medication. The defense argued she was in a mental health crisis and could not distinguish right from wrong, but prosecutors presented a different narrative. They pointed to evidence showing Carly had retrieved the gun, positioned herself strategically, sent text messages after the shooting, and attempted to stage an ambush. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Newman argued these actions demonstrated awareness and intent, not insanity. The moment that perhaps sealed Carly's fate came during cross-examination. Prosecutor Michael Smith asked, "If you try and cover up a crime, doesn't that indicate you know what you did?" Dr. Clark answered yes. The courtroom fell silent. After just over 2 hours of deliberation on September 20th, 2024, the jury found 15-year-old Carly Gregg guilty of murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole, plus 10 years. Today, Carly Madison Gregg is incarcerated at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility in the Youthful Offender Unit. Her defense has filed appeals, arguing her sentence is unconstitutional for a juvenile and that she did not receive a fair trial. Heath Smiley, who lost his wife and narrowly survived his own shooting, testified against Carly but still expressed care for her, at one point mouthing, "I love you," in the courtroom. The case remains a study in how mental health struggles, substance use, and family conflict can escalate into irreversible actions, captured frame by frame on a security system that was meant to protect the very people it ended up memorializing. Noura Jackson. Picture returning home at dawn to discover something that would shatter your world forever. Your mother, the person who raised you alone after divorce and tragedy, lying lifeless in a pool of blood. For most people, this would be the beginning of overwhelming grief. But what happens when detectives begin to suspect that the person who made that emergency call, the daughter who claimed to have found the body, might actually be the one who created that nightmare scene? What if every answer she gives raises more questions than it resolves? In the early morning hours of June 5, 2005, 18-year-old Noura Jackson pounded frantically on the door of neighbors across the street from her Memphis, Tennessee home. She was screaming that someone had broken into her house and her mother needed help. When Mayor Josiah Koch grabbed his pistol and rushed with Noura back to the residence, he found 39-year-old Jennifer Jackson lying on her bedroom floor, completely unclothed and surrounded by blood. The successful bond trader and triathlete had been stabbed more than 50 times. The bedroom was a scene of absolute carnage, with blood splattered across the sheets and walls. Jennifer's mouth was filled with blood, and she had stopped breathing. A wicker basket had been placed over her face. She was already gone. The scene appeared to tell a story of a break-in. A window in the garage door had been shattered, and there were drops of blood leading from the kitchen toward the bedroom. But investigators immediately noticed something off about the narrative. The broken window could only be accessed from inside the house, as all exterior doors remained locked. The hole in the glass lined up perfectly with an interior lock that could only be seen from the kitchen side. Police found no evidence of any intruder, and neighbors reported seeing no one suspicious that night. The sheer number of stab wounds suggested rage, and the basket over Jennifer's face indicated the attacker couldn't bear to look at her while committing the act. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Attention quickly turned to Noura herself. She told police she had been out all night, attending the local Italian festival, going to parties with friends, stopping for cigarettes and fast food, and simply driving around before arriving home at 5 in the morning. But her timeline began to unravel under scrutiny. Phone records showed her mobile was silent between 1 and 3 in the morning, precisely when investigators believed Jennifer had been killed. More damning was surveillance footage from a Walgreens pharmacy at 4 in the morning, showing Noura purchasing bandages and first aid supplies. She had a fresh cut on her left hand that she claimed came from falling at the festival, but she never mentioned this pharmacy stop to police. The video showed her asking for a towel to dab the wound, suggesting it was recent. Friends who testified painted a troubling picture of the relationship between mother and daughter. One friend, Kirby McDonald, recalled Noura saying at a party just hours before the killing that her mother was terrible and deserved to go to a place of eternal punishment. Others spoke of constant arguments between them. Prosecutors argued that Jennifer had been trying to rein in Noura's lifestyle of partying and substance use, even considering sending her away to boarding school. For an 18-year-old who valued her freedom above everything, this represented an unacceptable threat. The case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. No weapon was ever recovered. No forensic proof directly tied Noura to the crime. DNA from at least 2 unknown females was found at the scene, and a clump of blonde hair clutched in Jennifer's hand was never tested. Despite these gaps, a jury convicted Noura of second-degree murder in February 2009. She was 22 years old and received a sentence of 20 years and 9 months. The story took another turn in August 2014, when the Tennessee Supreme Court unanimously overturned her conviction. Prosecutors had violated her constitutional rights by withholding evidence and making improper statements during closing arguments. Rather than face a second trial, Noura accepted an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter in 2015, allowing her to maintain innocence while acknowledging the state had sufficient evidence. She walked out of prison in August 2016 after serving 11 years, still insisting she had nothing to do with her mother's death. The Innocence Project has since taken up her cause, seeking to prove what Noura has maintained all along, that she is not guilty of killing the mother she loved. Kristen Avery Pitman. How young is too young to understand the permanence of death? At what age does a child grasp the finality of pulling a trigger? These are questions society struggles to answer, and they become even more complex when medication enters the equation. When a 12-year-old commits an act so adult in its violence that it cannot be undone, how do we assign responsibility? And when that child stands in a courtroom years later, having confessed to the unthinkable, who exactly are we putting on trial? The person, the prescription, or the system that failed them both? In the early morning hours of November 29, 2001, hunters trudging through the woods near Chester, South Carolina, stumbled upon something unexpected. A small boy, barely a teenager, wandering alone with a shotgun slung over his shoulder. 12-year-old Christopher Pitman told them a harrowing story. A large man had broken into his grandparents' home, killed them both, set the house ablaze, kidnapped him, and forced him into their black Nissan Pathfinder before the vehicle became stuck in the mud. The boy claimed he had managed to escape when the stranger fled into the forest. The hunters, who also served as volunteer firefighters, rushed him to the Corinth Fire Department and alerted authorities. A massive search began for the phantom attacker who had destroyed the Pitman family. Meanwhile, investigators arriving at the smoldering remains of the home made a discovery. Inside, they found the bodies of 66-year-old Joe Frank Pitman and his wife Joy, 62. Both had been shot at close range with a .410 shotgun while they slept in their bed. The house had been deliberately set on fire, with candles and papers used to ignite the blaze. As officers processed the scene, the story Christopher had told began to crumble under the weight of physical facts. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of any intruder. The shotgun found with the boy belonged to his grandparents, and he had been taught to use it. At the police station, Detective Lucinda McCullough sat down with Christopher for what she called an adult conversation. She read him his rights. After hours of gentle questioning, punctuated by games of cards and naps, the 12-year-old's fabricated kidnapping story fell apart completely. He admitted everything. He had taken the shotgun from the gun cabinet, walked into his grandparents' bedroom shortly before midnight, and fired at them as they slept. Then he set the house on fire to cover what he had done, grabbed their car keys, $33 in cash, some weapons, and his golden retriever, and drove away. When asked why, he said simply that his grandparents deserved it. They had disciplined him earlier that evening with a paddle after he got into a fight on the school bus and was sent home early. But the story behind that night was more complicated than simple rebellion. Christopher had been bounced between homes for most of his life. His mother had abandoned him twice, disappearing from his world without explanation. His father, struggling through multiple divorces, had sent Christopher to live with Joe and Joy after the boy threatened to harm himself and ran away from home. At a troubled youth facility in Florida, doctors prescribed him Paxil for depression. When he arrived in South Carolina, his new physician switched him to Zoloft, doubling his dosage just 2 days before the killings. His sister later described him as appearing completely out of control during that time, experiencing what she called manic episodes. The case became a national flashpoint. In January 2005, Christopher was tried as an adult for 2 counts of murder. His defense team argued that the antidepressant had triggered a psychotic break, turning a troubled child into a killer. The prosecution countered that he knew exactly what he was doing, pointing to the deliberate cover-up, the fire timed with a candle so he could escape, the gathering of weapons and money, the fabricated kidnapping story. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on both counts. The judge handed down the minimum sentence allowed under South Carolina law, 30 years to life in prison. Christopher was just 15 years old at sentencing. Years of appeals followed. In July 2010, a judge granted her a new trial based on ineffective counsel. Rather than face another jury, she accepted a plea deal in December 2010, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 25-year sentence. During her incarceration, Christopher came out as transgender and legally changed her name to Kristen Avery Pitman. On February 22, 2023, she walked out of Allendale Institution after serving more than 21 years behind bars. She was 33 years old, having spent nearly 2/3 of her life in prison for a crime committed when most children are still in elementary school. Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Imagine spending your entire childhood confined to a wheelchair you didn't need, subjected to surgeries you didn't require, told you were dying from diseases you never had. Now imagine the person orchestrating this elaborate medical fraud wasn't a stranger or a doctor gone rogue, but your own mother. The woman who shaved your head to mimic chemotherapy, who drilled feeding tubes into your stomach, who chained you to your bed when you dared question the lies. When does survival instinct override every other moral consideration? And when that breaking point finally arrives, does the law see a murderer or a victim who found the only escape route she could imagine? 23-year-old Gypsy Rose Blanchard appeared to be the picture of maternal devotion when seen with her mother, Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard. Neighbors in Springfield, Missouri knew them as an inspiring duo. A selfless caregiver and her terminally ill daughter. The community had rallied around them for years, building them a house through Habitat for Humanity after Hurricane Katrina displaced them from Louisiana in 2005. They received free trips to Disney World, visits with celebrities, and an outpouring of donations. Gypsy seemed to suffer from a terrifying array of conditions, including leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizure disorder, and the developmental capacity of a 7-year-old due to brain damage. She communicated through a wheelchair, appeared unable to walk, and required constant care from the devoted Dee Dee. But on June 14th, 2015, a disturbing message appeared on the Facebook page the mother and daughter shared. "That bitch is dead." Friends who saw the post immediately contacted authorities, fearing something terrible had happened. When sheriff's deputies entered the Blanchard home that evening, they found Dee Dee lying face down in her bedroom, surrounded by blood. She had been stabbed multiple times several days earlier. Gypsy was nowhere to be found, and her wheelchair remained in the house. Initially, everyone assumed the worst, that whoever killed Dee Dee had kidnapped her fragile, disabled daughter. The reality police uncovered was far stranger than anyone imagined. Using the IP address from the Facebook post, officers traced it to Big Bend, Wisconsin, where they found Gypsy with her internet boyfriend, 26-year-old Nicholas Gojon. When they arrested her, something immediately struck the responding officers as odd. Gypsy Rose Blanchard could walk. She could walk perfectly well. Greene County Sheriff Jim Arnott would later tell reporters something that would become the defining statement of the entire case. Things are not always as they appear. The investigation revealed a story of prolonged abuse that defied comprehension. Gypsy had never been sick. Not with leukemia. Not with muscular dystrophy. Not with anything Dee Dee had claimed over 2 decades. Her mother, who had worked as a nurse's aide, had systematically convinced doctors, family members, charities, and an entire community that her daughter was chronically ill. Experts would later suggest Dee Dee suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare psychological disorder where caregivers fabricate or induce illness in those under their care to gain attention and sympathy. Gypsy had endured unnecessary eye surgeries, had her salivary glands removed, and lived with a feeding tube she didn't need. Dee Dee shaved her daughter's head regularly and kept her isolated from peers. When Gypsy tried to assert independence, her mother would physically restrain her with handcuffs and dog leashes, placing bells on the doors to monitor her movements. Around 2012, Gypsy created a secret online dating profile and connected with Gojon. For nearly 3 years, they maintained a hidden relationship. As Dee Dee's control intensified, Gypsy became increasingly desperate. She knew she was healthy. She knew the lies. But she also knew her mother would never let her go. Together, she and Gojon began planning Dee Dee's murder. On June 10, 2015, Gojon arrived at the Blanchard home. Gypsy let him inside, allegedly providing him with gloves, duct tape, and a knife. She retreated to the bathroom, covering her ears as he stabbed Dee Dee 4 times while she slept. Afterward, they took over $4,000 in cash from the house and fled to Wisconsin by bus. In July 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea agreement and entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The prosecutor declined to pursue the death penalty or life imprisonment, acknowledging the exceptional nature of the case. She received 10 years in prison. Gojon went to trial, was convicted of first-degree murder in November 2018, and received life without parole in February 2019. On December 28, 2023, After serving 8 years, Gypsy Rose Blanchard walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Center. She was 32 years old. In interviews since her release, she has spoken openly about her regret, stating she experiences guilt daily and wishes she had found another way to escape. Her case remains one of the most complex intersections of abuse, mental illness, and criminal justice in recent American history, raising questions about culpability that have no simple answers. Hannah Thomas. 17 years of accumulated trauma do not simply dissolve into silence. They build, layer upon layer, creating pressure that can warp judgment and twist reality until even the unthinkable begins to feel like an escape route. For Hannah Thomas, that pressure came from 3 different directions. The adoptive parents, who had tormented her for years. The biological mother, whose recent behavior had become increasingly volatile. And the teenage boyfriend, who would ultimately pull a trigger in her mother's kitchen on December 28, 2020. The question that would later divide a courtroom was not whether she participated in the killing, but whether she was a perpetrator or simply another victim trapped in an impossible situation. The Greece Police Department in New York arrived at Ottilia Piros's home on West Parkway for what should have been a routine welfare check. Officers had been contacted by police in St. Robert, Missouri, who had pulled over 2 teenagers during a traffic stop and were unable to reach their families. What investigators found inside the Greece residence was anything but routine. 36-year-old Ottilia Piros lay deceased in her kitchen, shot twice in the head. Her 17-year-old daughter Hannah and Hannah's 16-year-old boyfriend, Richard Avila, were more than 1,000 miles away, having fled in Piros's vehicle immediately after the shooting. The circumstances leading to that December morning were far more complex than a simple act of teenage rebellion. Hannah Thomas had been born Christiana Doan, and her early childhood had been marked by instability that eventually led to her removal from her biological parents' care. What followed was even worse. Between the ages of 6 and 11, Hannah endured what court documents would later describe as extreme abuse and torture at the hands of her adoptive parents in Arizona. She and her adoptive sister were starved to the point of malnourishment, forced to live outside while naked, and subjected to hours of extreme physical exercise as punishment. Duct tape was placed over her mouth for days at a time. She was dressed as a baby and forced to wear diapers inside the home. Her adoptive parents would eventually be prosecuted and imprisoned for these crimes, but the damage to Hannah's psychological development had already been done. After being removed from her adoptive parents' custody, Hannah had been living with her maternal grandmother in Arizona. In 2020, however, her grandmother left her in the care of Ottilia Piros in Greece, New York. Hannah had hoped for a fresh start with her biological mother, but instead found herself in another abusive environment. Court records detail how Piros would slap Hannah during arguments, threaten suicide when Hannah expressed wanting to return to Arizona, and refused to take her to a hospital while she was miscarrying a pregnancy and experiencing excruciating pain just days before the killing. On that December morning, Richard Avila fired the shots that ended Ottilia Piros's life. Both teenagers then fled across state lines in Piros's car, driving for hours before being stopped by Missouri police on December 29, 2020. They were extradited back to New York to face murder charges. In January 2023, both Hannah Thomas and Richard Avila entered guilty pleas to manslaughter in the first degree. Each received sentences of 25 years in the New York State Department of Corrections plus 5 years of post-release supervision. The Monroe County District Attorney called it a violent act of betrayal, emphasizing that the killing had been committed without provocation or reason. But the legal story did not end there. In 2024, the Appellate Division 4th Department of the New York State Supreme Court took an extraordinary step. Despite the fact that Thomas had waived her right to appeal as part of her plea agreement, the court exercised its interest of justice power to review her sentence under the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. The appellate court found overwhelming evidence that Hannah had been a documented victim of abuse throughout her life. Even her maternal grandmother, Ottilia Pyrrhus's own mother, had pleaded for leniency in Hannah's case. In July 2025, the court reduced Hannah's sentence from 25 years to just 5 years. She was released from prison on July 31, 2025, having served approximately 2 years of her original sentence. Richard Avila, however, remains incarcerated, as the court's ruling applied only to Hannah. As of November 2025, Hannah Thomas is 22 years old and attempting to rebuild a life that has been defined by suffering since childhood. Her case raises difficult questions about culpability, trauma, and justice. While she participated in the events that led to her mother's death, the courts ultimately determined that her history of documented abuse warranted extraordinary consideration. Kathleen Dorsett. A kindergarten classroom is supposed to be a place of safety, where children learn their colors and practice tying their shoes under the watchful eye of someone they trust. For years, Kathleen Dorsett embodied that trust as an elementary school teacher at Gables School in Neptune Township, New Jersey. Parents entrusted their 5-year-olds to her care, never suspecting that this woman who reads stories and supervised recess had orchestrated something far darker in her own life. The disconnect between her public persona and private actions would become so stark that a judge would later describe her tears in court as performance, calling her crocodile displays that turned on and off at will. Stephen Moore was 42 years old and finally finding his footing in life when everything was taken from him. A former champion speed skater who had drifted through his 20s with a laid-back approach to responsibility, he had settled into steady work at a Honda dealership and married Kathleen in June 2007. Their daughter Elizabeth arrived the following year, and friends noticed a transformation in Stephen. The carefree bachelor had become a devoted father, but his marriage was unraveling almost as quickly as it had begun. Kathleen complained to her parents that Stephen could not provide adequately for their family, and her mother and father, Thomas and Leslie Dorsett, began inserting themselves into the couple's lives with increasing frequency. They appeared at the house unannounced at all hours, and Stephen grew to resent their constant presence. By the time Elizabeth was 10 months old, he had moved back in with his mother and filed for divorce. What followed was an acrimonious custody battle that brought out the worst in everyone involved. Stephen accused his father-in-law of mistreating Elizabeth. The divorce decree issued requirements that enraged the Dorsett family, including provisions that they would need to help find Stephen a home in Florida, where they were planning to relocate and subsidize his rent. The weekend of August 16, 2010, Stephen was scheduled to have his first 3-day overnight visit with his daughter. It was a prospect the Dorsetts apparently could not tolerate. That morning, Stephen arrived at the Dorsett residence in Oakhurst to drop off Elizabeth for what he thought would be a routine custody exchange. Kathleen met him in the driveway and told him he had left some tools in the backyard. She asked him to retrieve them. What Stephen did not know was that her father was waiting for him, concealed and ready. Thomas Dorsett confronted his former son-in-law, and an argument ensued. Then he struck Stephen in the head with a heavy cable. When Stephen fell, Thomas wrapped a rope around his neck and strangled him until he stopped moving. Kathleen helped her father stuff Stephen's body into the trunk of his mother's Nissan Altima. They hired a man named Anthony Morris for $3,000 to burn the car with Stephen's body still inside. When Morris failed to complete the task, Thomas did it himself. Stephen was reported missing when he failed to show up for work at the dealership. 2 days later, on August 18, 2010, his remains were found in the trunk of his mother's burned vehicle in Long Branch. The investigation moved quickly. Kathleen was arrested on August 23 and charged with murder and tampering with evidence. Her father attempted suicide outside his attorney's office by ingesting refrigerant, but survived and was charged as well. The case took an even darker turn when investigators uncovered another plot. While awaiting trial, Kathleen and her mother, Leslie, attempted to arrange a hit on Stephen's mother, Evelyn Moore, who had gained custody of Elizabeth. They wanted to silence her testimony and keep her from raising their granddaughter. Leslie met with someone she believed was a hired killer, but who was actually an undercover detective. She negotiated payment and suggested the death should look natural, mentioning that Evelyn was diabetic. The conversation was recorded, and Leslie joined her husband and daughter behind bars. In May 2013, all three members of the Dorsett family entered guilty pleas. Kathleen admitted she knowingly sent Stephen to his death in that backyard. She was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Her father received 45 years. Her mother, who was released in December 2016, served 7 years. At sentencing, Judge Anthony Malachi rejected Kathleen's claims that the murder was not about custody, stating plainly that control was exactly what motivated the killing. He described her as deeply self-centered and said the case represented an American family destruction on multiple levels. Kathleen Dorsett is currently incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Union Township, New Jersey. She will not be eligible for parole until August 2057, when she will be 83 years old. Her daughter Elizabeth, who was 20 months old when her father was murdered, is now a teenager being raised by Evelyn Moore's family, far from the woman who valued control over everything else. Virginia McCullough. The early years of Virginia McCullough's life were unremarkable in the grand scheme of things, but the seeds of tragedy were unknowingly planted in her youth. Raised in a modest home with her siblings and doting parents, Virginia was always viewed as quiet but dependable. She never stood out in the same way some of her more charismatic peers did, but she was well liked, and there was nothing to suggest that anything might be amiss. Her parents, hardworking and unassuming, adored her, and their relationship seemed like the epitome of familial harmony. However, this picture-perfect image would soon unravel in a way no one could have predicted. In the year 1996, Virginia McCullough's life would take a drastic turn. The police would soon find themselves investigating what appeared to be a family tragedy, a crime so grotesque and calculated that it left the entire community in disbelief. Virginia had betrayed the very people who had loved her most, her own family. At the heart of this chilling tale was a gruesome murder, the brutal killing of Virginia's father, a beloved figure who had devoted his life to providing for his children. Yet, it wasn't just the death that would capture the public's attention. It was the manner in which Virginia, the quiet daughter, had orchestrated the crime from behind the scenes. The plot that unfolded was one of manipulation and cold-heartedness. Virginia had been involved in a sordid affair, and she believed that the only way to secure her future was to eliminate the one person standing in her way, her father. The crime was meticulously planned, each detail thought out with disturbing precision. She enlisted the help of a man with a violent past, someone whose loyalty she had gained through manipulation. Together, they carried out the unthinkable, and the murder was executed with a level of brutality that shocked even the most hardened detectives. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Virginia had not acted alone. Her involvement in the murder was not merely as a passive participant. She had been the driving force behind the crime, pulling the strings from the shadows. Evidence soon surfaced, linking her to the crime scene, and her alibi crumbled under the weight of conflicting testimonies. Yet, the most chilling aspect of the entire ordeal was the revelation that Virginia had plotted her father's murder, not out of hate, but out of a cold, calculated desire to secure her own financial future. The trial that followed captivated the public. Virginia McCullough's defense team tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, claiming that she had been driven to act out of fear and desperation. But the prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing the extent of her manipulation and the coldness with which she had planned the murder. It wasn't just the act of killing that made Virginia's crime so heinous, it was the betrayal of trust, the way she had turned on her own family. Her actions shattered the fragile sense of security that her parents had worked so hard to build, and the community was left reeling. On the 1997 court date, Virginia McCullough was sentenced to life in prison. The judge's words were firm as he spoke of the irreversible harm she had caused, not only to her family but to society as a whole. There was no sympathy in his tone, only a recognition that the crime she had committed was one of the most grotesque betrayals imaginable. Virginia, however, showed little remorse for her actions, a fact that only deepened the horror of her crime. As Virginia McCullough languished in prison, the legacy of her crime continued to haunt her family. Her siblings, who had once shared fond memories of growing up together, found it difficult to reconcile the person they had known with the monster she had become. Her mother, left alone to mourn the loss of her husband and the daughter who had destroyed their family, would never fully recover from the shock of Virginia's betrayal. For the McCullough family, the pain would last long after the trial had ended. Virginia McCullough's story serves as a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The quiet daughter, the one who seemed so unremarkable, was capable of unimaginable violence. It's a testament to the fact that evil can sometimes wear the face of someone you least expect, and that even the closest family bonds are not immune to the corrosive effects of greed, manipulation, and betrayal. Jennifer Mee. What does it mean when a girl who once captured the sympathy of a nation becomes someone capable of luring a man to his death? What does it mean when the teenager who sat on morning television shows hiccuping through interviews transforms into a central figure in a deadly robbery? And what does it mean when the sweetness of sudden fame becomes an addiction, and the young woman who once tasted the spotlight will do anything to feel important again, even if it costs another person his life? In the year 2007, 15-year-old Jennifer Mee of St. Petersburg, Florida, became an unexpected media fascination. For reasons no doctor could explain, she developed an endless and uncontrollable case of hiccups. Minute after minute, hour after hour, she hiccuped as many as 50 times, and the strange condition persisted for 5 long weeks. The story traveled quickly across television screens in America. She appeared on The Today Show, on Inside Edition, and on many national broadcasts. Viewers watched this young girl struggle with a problem that appeared both bizarre and heartbreaking. She tried hypnosis, medication, prayer, and every remedy people suggested. Then, without warning, the hiccups stopped. Her brief moment in the national spotlight faded, and Jennifer Mee returned to her ordinary life. But inside her, something had changed. She had tasted attention, and losing it felt like losing a part of herself. After her sudden rise and fall from fame, Jennifer drifted into a period of turmoil. In June of 2007, she ran away from home, and the disappearance brought a small wave of local curiosity. She was reported missing again in January 2010. But by then, her hiccup story was old news. The world had already turned its attention to new headlines. Jennifer, now a troubled young adult, was no longer being interviewed, no longer being pitied, and no longer being watched. She began dating a man named Lamont Newton, and the two later lived with a friend named Laron Ryford. In that unstable environment, surrounded by people already involved in crime, Jennifer developed a plan that she believed would solve her problems and possibly return some of the attention she no longer had. On the night of October 23, 2010, 22-year-old Shannon Griffin thought he was meeting a girl he had spoken with online to purchase marijuana. He followed Jennifer to the back of an empty home in St. Petersburg. Shannon had recently moved to Florida and worked at Walmart. He had no reason to fear the encounter, but hidden in the darkness were Ryford and Newton, waiting with a .38 caliber handgun. The plan was to rob him quickly and escape. When the robbery began, Shannon fought back. During the struggle, he was shot 4 times in the chest and died at the scene. His pockets were emptied, and all that was taken from him was less than $50. Police quickly linked the crime to the 3 suspects who lived together. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had been the one who contacted Shannon online and guided him to the location. Although she never pulled the trigger, Florida law made her equally responsible for the killing because the death occurred during the commission of a felony. The strongest evidence against her came from her own voice. Jail officials recorded a phone call between Jennifer and her mother. When her mother asked what happened, Jennifer responded with a confession that removed any doubt. She said she had not killed anyone herself, but had set everything up and that the situation had fallen apart. Prosecutors also presented forensic testimony, showing that her DNA was found on the victim's shirt. Her attorneys argued that Jennifer suffered from mental illness. They claimed she had schizophrenia and that her past medical issues pointed to deeper neurological problems. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. The expert concluded that while her intelligence was in the low normal range and she had mental health concerns, she fully understood what she was doing. In September of 2013, after a 5-day trial and 4 hours of jury deliberation, Jennifer Mee was found guilty of first-degree felony murder. She broke down in tears as the verdict was read. Under Florida law, the only possible sentence for that conviction was life in prison without parole. Her 2 co-defendants received the same punishment. A robbery that gained almost nothing had destroyed several lives. As of 2025, Jennifer Mee remains in prison, a tragic example of how quickly a life can descend once the spotlight fades. The girl who once charmed the country with an uncontrollable medical mystery will now spend the rest of her days behind bars, remembered not for hiccups, but for a senseless killing that ended a young man's life over pocket change.